Everybody said there's a fire, and I guess they were burning documents or burning papers, and I wonder what that's all about.
Well, that was clearly a rhetorical question by the US president. Donald Trump knows very well what's going on. Just over a week ago, he ordered China to shut down its consulate in Houston, suspecting they were spying on Americans and stealing intellectual property. Within hours, consulate staff started burning and destroying documents. Neighbours called the fire service, but they weren't allowed into the building. Whatever staff couldn't burn, they took away in trucks and cars. 3 days later, China hit back, closing the US consulate in Chengdu. So what goes on at all these consulates, and how many so-called diplomats are actually spies? In a moment, we'll hear from Canada's former ambassador to Afghanistan. He's got a few tales to tell. And we'll hear from a cybersecurity expert who's advised the last 6 US presidents, including the current one. And of course, we'll have the view from Beijing, where people see it all very differently. But first, a quick look at how all of this unfolded over 3 frantic days.
Shows 400 Street. Going to be a worker. We're getting multiple calls on it. All right, I got engine 13 arriving on scene.
Right now at 10, breaking news. Houston firefighters and police responding to the Chinese consulate in Montrose after reports of a fire.
Firefighters and police officers, they responded. Obviously, you can see them behind me, but did not actually go into the property. We have a view from above that shows what looks like several bins or containers on fire. Law enforcement on scene tells me that people in the neighboring buildings reported seeing people tossing things into those containers.
You could just smell the paper burning.
The State Department says the closure was in response to repeated Chinese violations of American sovereignty, including massive illegal spying.
U.S. officials claim that Houston was a hub for espionage and that China recently escalated its theft of intellectual property from U.S. institutions.
We are setting out clear expectations for how the Chinese Communist Party is going to behave. And when they don't, we're going to take actions that protect the American people, protect our security, our national security, and also protect our economy and jobs.
Now, this is a significant escalation in a growing conflict between the world's 2 largest economies.
China strongly condemns such an outrageous and unjustified move, which will sabotage China-U.S. relations.
As far as closing additional embassies, it's always possible. You see what's going on. We thought there was a fire in the one that we did close, and everybody said there's a fire, and I guess they were burning documents or burning papers, and I wonder what that's all about.
This may now result in significant action on their part.
China has retaliated for the eviction, ordering the closure of the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. It's not clear if either side could order more consulates closed.
Well, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Could we see more closures? Each country has, or rather had, 5 consulates. China's are in New York, Chicago, and 2 in California, San Francisco and Los Angeles. And until last week, Houston, Texas. The American ones are based in Guangzhou, Shanghai, Shenyang, Wuhan, and again, until last week, Chengdu. And of course, both countries have embassies in each other's capitals. Okay, let's bring in our guest now, and we're going to begin with Chris Alexander, who was Canada's ambassador to Afghanistan and a diplomat who worked in various consulates for nearly 2 decades. Ina Tangen is an American businessman in Beijing, and James Lewis is a cybersecurity expert who has advised every US president since Ronald Reagan, which was quite some time ago there, James. Chris, I'd like to start with you, as I said. Just quickly explain, what is the difference between a consulate and an embassy?
Well, a consulate can do all the business that an embassy does, but it has a region assigned to it that is not the capital. So there can be only one embassy of one country in another country, but there can be a much larger number of consulates. For instance, Canada has dozens of consulates in the United States because of our very close relationship.
Now, the most intriguing picture to come out of this whole episode was of people making fires and then putting them out, and then the fire trucks arriving. You've worked in embassies and consulates for years. You say that's pretty standard practice.
Well, if you have to get out fast, it's standard practice. The most common situation in which you'd have recourse to these burn barrels and hammers and other procedures that we're all trained in is in the case of civil strife or rioting that would threaten to engulf or overrun the embassy. And we've seen that happen in recent decades to many countries' diplomatic facilities. This is a bit different because the consulates in each case were being closed by order of the host government, and the deadline for leaving was very short indeed, and so there wasn't the luxury of any other means other than lighting fires, literally.
Let's look at the reason why the United States asked for that consulate to be closed down. In a statement, they said, look, it's well accepted that the consulates will host various different agencies of the other government and even intelligence agencies. They accept that. But they say that the Chinese intelligence agencies, or spies if you like, were going well beyond to such a degree that they threatened US national security. Do you think they've overdone it here, or are they about right?
I'm sure that they're actually, with those public remarks, being relatively moderate compared to what the reality is. I think there's been a lot of denial and inattention to Chinese intelligence gathering because for the last 30 years, China and all of its partners, particularly among advanced economies, have gained from a very strongly advancing, rapidly expanding economic relationship.
I know. What is Beijing's take on their consulate in Houston being shut down?
Well, I mean, there was a theory that the U.S. Had allowed a lot of the consular officials and anybody associated with the government and their families to go back to the United States. They wanted to come back. Unfortunately, the situation for them was that they would be treated the same as everyone else, that they would have to have a COVID-19 test, and that they would have to be isolated for 14 days. The U.S. objected based on this idea that taking the test would collect DNA evidence. I don't know what good it would be to the Chinese, and that diplomatic immunity prevented them from being detained for 14 days. So that apparently wound its way up through Pompeo and to President Trump. And the decision was made that they wanted to use this as an opportunity to make a strong statement that China is an aggressive spying entity in line with the O'Donnell and Associates big book coronavirus strategy for reelecting the Senate and the president, which was to constantly attack China. So when you have a piece of paper like that was openly shared, and you have these types of actions, I think the Chinese see this as kind of in concert. I'd like to respond to something that Chris said. You know, I understand that you can be a China hawk and you can say that China's a very bad entity, but while opinions are great, it's better to back them up with facts. I was a prosecutor. I don't accept that you can just go out there and say, oh, these things are happening or everybody knows. Generally, in the United States, the idea is that you have the rule of law, that when you want to accuse somebody, you give them the opportunity to respond. And obviously, that is not something that's being afforded to the Chinese government or Huawei in any kind of substantial form. There's this kind of ongoing attacks, throwing 47,000 plates into the air so that you can't.
Okay, let's go to James. Let's take that point to James. Ina is saying that it was a very different reason why they shut down the Chinese consulate in Houston, and that the United States has made many accusations about how the consulates coordinate spying, but actually haven't put forward any proof. What do you say to that, James?
I have bad news for people who think that the relationship with China is driven by politics or will somehow get better. We have substantial evidence when it comes to Chinese espionage. You could look at the most recent indictment, which is quite long, and one of the rules here for the Justice Department is they will not indict people until they feel confident they have enough evidence to win in court. I myself was in meetings with Chinese officials where we had a discussion about how we spy on them, they spy on us. Everyone acknowledges that. We wanted them not to do commercial espionage, not to steal companies' IP. So I don't think there should be any doubt. I have dozens of examples there's no doubt that the Chinese have begun a massive espionage campaign, but it's simply an expansion of one that has been going on for several decades. So why would this? First, this is espionage. You're not going to publish it in the newspaper. Two, any country, when you ask them, are you spying? Their answer is no, of course not. How can you think that? So for the Chinese to deny this isn't unusual, but for justice to come out with several powerful indictments, you can find the wanted posters online, by the way, suggests that we've reached a breaking point when it comes to Chinese behavior.
Can we just take a look at another issue around the consulates here? And we know that a couple of days after it was closed, it was announced by the Department of Justice that it had charged 4 Chinese scientists with visa fraud. They had allegedly lied about their connections with the Chinese military in order to work at America's top university. One of them, Wan Tang, actually evaded arrest by running to the Chinese consulate in San Francisco, but is now in US police custody. Now, James, the Department of Justice says that those 4 were part of a much bigger network being coordinated by the consulates. The network operates in some 25 cities. As I say, they're supported by the consulates, according to the Department of Justice. What more can you tell us about that?
China's taken advantage of the openness of Western societies, not just the US, but others, to send over students, businessmen, researchers. One of the things we've discovered is that some percentage of these Chinese citizens, whether they're students or researchers, are connected to the Chinese government and act as intelligence collectors. In Houston, you have, of course, NASA headquarters, you have the oil and gas industry, and you have a large biomedical research center where a number of Chinese were visiting as researchers. And that is the crux of the decision to focus on Houston, is that the Chinese, as Chris said, like many states, including the US, use the consulates as a base for espionage. In China's case, though, it's gotten way out of hand, and we're finally taking action against them.
I know you probably see it, or Beijing probably sees it far more as political expediency on the part of President Trump, trying to deflect away from his performance.
Well, there's that. There's also, it seems quite clear that Pompeo is trying to start a campaign for 2024. This is well coordinated, and I think this is just part of politics. One of the things that strikes me here is that the U.S. and Canada, along with our other things, are part of a Five Eyes network. That is the most powerful information and espionage group in the world. And as we've seen from the Snowden leaks and also from WikiLeaks, it's quite extensive. This idea that somehow a naive America who doesn't know anything about spying is being taken advantage of by China seems a little bit much.
I just want to explain for our viewers who perhaps think that intellectual property theft is a bit dry, how important it is and how much damage it can do to a society. Let's take the case of Nortel. Some of you will say who, and here's why.
Nortel was Canada's greatest ever tech company, a cutting-edge telecoms equipment manufacturer which dominated the fiber optic network market. It had invented a touchscreen interactive device almost a decade before the iPhone. At its peak in 2000, it employed 90,000 people and accounted for a third of the country's top stock index. During the 1990s and 2000s, it turned sleepy Ottawa into a kind of Silicon Valley, and now it's dead. Its soaring success attracted the attention of Chinese hackers, who started to suck the life out of it in the late 1990s. By 2004, they'd hacked the CEO himself, Frank Dunn. That year, hundreds of sensitive Nortel documents were siphoned off to an IP address registered as Shanghai Factiancore, which had no known business dealings with Nortel. No one knows exactly who hacked Nortel or where the data went. Western cybersecurity experts strongly suspect it was the Chinese government. At the same time Nortel was being hacked, Beijing was promoting Huawei as a competitor, giving it massive financial support and giving countries like Nigeria huge loans to buy Huawei equipment. Huawei denies knowing Nortel was being hacked, and it denies having links to the Chinese government. Still, as Nortel collapsed, Huawei took its customers and hired about 20 of its scientists who had been developing the groundwork for 5G wireless technology. Nortel is dead and Huawei is thriving.
Chris, you're from Canada. How would you explain what happened to Nortel?
Well, I think people were asleep and quiescent and complacent at a time when we should already have been more vigilant. Nortel was a leading company globally in many areas, switching technology in the 1990s, before and even after. It was a leading player, especially in terms of research and development. And today it's painful as a Canadian to see this Huawei conflict playing out, because those in the industry who knew both companies see Huawei as the 2020 version of what Nortel might have become had not intellectual property theft happened on a grand scale, aided by states, aided by this flooding approach that the Chinese government takes through the United Front and other means to obtain intelligence, bring it home, and then deploy it for economic benefit. It's something that cannot happen again on this scale if we want to have a fair, equitable, and successful international trading system.
And what impact
which has to
did
be
it
based
have?
on protections for intellectual property.
And what impact did it have on the 90,000 people or so who worked for Nortel?
Well, a huge impact. It was the biggest company by far based in Ottawa and one of the biggest in Canada. The headquarters of Nortel are now becoming the headquarters of our Department of National Defense, because they were vast. And that company went down to almost nothing. It's broken into various spin-offs, but a huge group of engineers and other experts who had worked for Nortel literally went to work for Huawei after the intellectual property had been transferred in the most ruthless and subversive of ways.
Ina, do you think, from Beijing's perspective, this is just a case of sour grapes? Huawei was the better company. It outcompeted Nortel. It moved with the times. And that those who would point the finger at China are simply failing to accept that reality?
Well, it goes beyond that. I mean, Chris's account is revisionist, to say the least. Nortel was a slow-motion train wreck that was happening for quite some time. It had a massive fallout in 2000, had nothing to do with China, unless Chris has some new tin hat idea. And they lost all their value. I mean, at one time, they were 1/3 of the value on the Toronto Stock Exchange. It had 90,000 employees, as you pointed out. 2000, their stock went down to minuscule levels. Then in 2009, after a series of missteps, mismanagement, they were told about, there's somebody's hacking in. They ignored it. It just imploded. And basically, not because it didn't have good technology, but simply because no one believed that it was able to service its clients. An upstart, Huawei came in, started offering service, better costs, better pricing, and they won the market.
Chris, as I understand it, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, Canada's sort of answer to the CIA, apparently was warning Nortel back in the late 1990s.
They absolutely were. And Nortel took some action, not enough. There were also management issues at Nortel. There is no question. But there's a whole library of books documenting the intellectual property theft that took place. And that is now weighing not only on Huawei's reputation, but on China's reputation as they get shut out of more and more markets because of concern that they are not willing to observe even elementary forms, the rule of law. In Canada, we haven't banned Huawei altogether from bidding on 5G technology, but our major telcos that had awarded those large contracts to Huawei in the past have now said they will not use Huawei backbones in their 5G technology because of the risks that we've all been outlining.
James, I need to just bring you in for a moment. Apparently, 1 in 5 major US companies have reported that the Chinese are stealing their intellectual property. Is that estimate about right?
No, it's far too low. We have a standing joke in this field that there are the companies that know they've been hacked, and they're the minority. The majority of the companies that have been hacked and don't know it. I have lots of stories about Huawei. It's a shameless company. My favorite is they stole intellectual property from an American technology company and then tried to sell it back. I mean, that's really over the top. I know people who helped arrest Huawei employees who were surreptitiously dismantling Nortel equipment and taking pictures of it. I mean, the record here goes back well into the last century. And Huawei, in particular, is a company that does not play by the rules. And one of the things that, yes, they have a price differential. A European country just bought from Huawei because Huawei came in and offered a 30% discount over another supplier, right? And I asked that European country, do you think Huawei offered you that discount because they admire your cuisine? No, it's the Chinese government subsidizing Huawei so that it can get signals intelligence access to national networks.
James, I want to just bring up something the FBI director said. I believe you were moderating the debate at your think tank, and he was present. He was saying something along the lines of that China was the biggest law enforcement threat to the United States. Can we just have a listen to that?
As I stand here talking with you today, the FBI has about 1,000 investigations involving China's attempted theft of U.S.-based technology in all 56 of our field offices and spanning just about every industry and sector. We know that through their 1,000 Talents plans and similar programs, they try to entice scientists at our universities to bring their knowledge back to China, even if that means stealing proprietary information or violating export controls or conflict of interest policies.
Now, James, as I say, you were moderating that appearance by the FBI director. He was talking about how U.S. universities are being exploited. Tell us about what happened back in January with the arrest of the Harvard professor Charles Lieber. He's one of the greatest chemists in the world.
The Chinese still are dependent on Western technology, and so that means they send students, they invest in companies, and they have researchers at universities. And the U.S. has unfortunately discovered that a number of these researchers are connected to the Chinese military or the Chinese intelligence services. More importantly, the Chinese try and recruit researchers through a number of programs. 1,000 Talents is the most famous, where they say, come to China, we'll pay you for your research, we'll give you a stipend, we'll give you money. In this particular case, the chairman of a Harvard medical department was arrested, not because he was working with the Chinese, but because he'd failed to disclose that they were paying him to give them the research he was doing under a grant from the US government. So we're going to have a period of cleanup here where the kind of fast and loose rules that governed academics in the US for many years are going to come under scrutiny. We found we were subsidizing PLA researchers. That's insane. And that's the kind of thing that will have to change.
The PLA being the People's Liberation Army of China. I'd like to give you the last word here. I know that you said in the past that if you were to look at the relationship, do the mirror test, if you like, Beijing has far more to be concerned about because the United States has a far greater presence, a far greater number of diplomats in China.
Absolutely. Not only diplomats, but if you use this thing that if you're a member of the Communist Party, you should be indicted if you're a member of the military. Let's say China turned that around. Anyone who's a member of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party or is a member of the military shouldn't be in China. I mean, it was not so long ago that Obama said we should endeavor to stop using for intelligence gathering purposes, these programs for inoculating children around the world. I mean, yes, the spying goes on. I'm sure there are Chinese, but to attribute every single act of industrial espionage to the Chinese government is a bit laughable. I mean, I know you want to kind of portray this image, but it just doesn't bear the sniff test. The fact is, You're the most the U.S. is the most well-funded military and intelligence nation on earth. The idea that we're having problems with China is somewhat absurd. The fact is, China is ahead of the game, and that's why we are seeing it as an existential threat to our hegemony. I mean, both economic and political. So at this point, saying that they're copying stuff when they're actually ahead seems a little bit odd.
Ina Tangin, with that incendiary remark, I could hear James and Chris grumbling, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. We will end the show. Ina Tangin, James Lewis, and Chris Alexander, thank you all for your contributions to the Nexus, and thank you at home and on your mobiles for watching. Remember, you can see this episode and all our previous episodes on our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week, then, goodbye.